I spent 30 years building that house with my own 2 hands, but it only took my son-in-law 10 seconds to tell me I no longer belonged in it. I did not scream or shout when I saw my packed bags sitting on the cold concrete of the porch, because a loud man shows his hand, and I needed my son-in-law to believe I was exactly the helpless old fool he thought I was. My name is Dan. I am 68 years old, a retired building contractor, and until a chilly Tuesday afternoon last October, I believed my greatest achievement was the family I had provided for. I had just returned from a 2-week fishing trip up in the high mountain lakes. It was an annual tradition I started after my wife passed away 5 years ago. 2 weeks of absolute silence, cold morning air, and the simple rhythm of casting a line into the dark water. The trip always left me physically exhausted but spiritually recharged. Driving my heavy-duty truck down the familiar winding roads toward home, all I could think about was a hot shower, a warm meal cooked in my own kitchen, and sleeping in my own bed. I pulled into the wide driveway I had paved myself. The massive oak trees I planted as saplings when my daughter was just a toddler were shedding their autumn leaves across the lawn. The house stood there, 2 stories of sturdy brick and custom timber framing, a testament to decades of my sweat and labor. Every joint, every beam, every custom cabinet inside was something I had either built or overseen. It was not just a piece of real estate to me. It was the physical manifestation of my life's work. I parked the truck, grabbed my heavy canvas duffel bag from the passenger seat, and walked up the stone pathway to the heavy oak front door. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my brass key ring, and slid the familiar key into the deadbolt. It went in smoothly, but when I tried to turn it, the cylinder refused to budge. I frowned, pulling the key out and wiping it on my jeans, thinking perhaps some grit had gotten caught in the grooves. I pushed it back in and twisted harder. Nothing. That was when I looked closer at the hardware. It was not my solid brass lock. It was a cheap, flimsy, brushed nickel deadbolt, the kind you buy in bulk at a discount hardware store. The kind of lock a master carpenter like myself would never dream of installing on a sturdy exterior door. Before I could raise my fist to knock, the door swung inward. Standing in the foyer, blocking the entrance to my own home, was my son-in-law, Greg. Greg was a man who wore expensive suits bought on credit, slicked his hair back with too much product, and always had a new scheme to get rich quick without doing any actual labor. Hovering a few steps behind him in the hallway, looking down at the hardwood floor, was my daughter, Sarah. She wrapped her arms around herself, refusing to meet my eyes. "Hey, Dan," Greg said. His voice was entirely too casual, carrying the false breezy tone of a corporate middle manager delivering bad news to a subordinate. "We need to talk." I stood on the welcome mat, my heavy duffel bag hanging from my shoulder. I looked past him into the living room, noticing that my favorite leather armchair had already been pushed into a corner, replaced by a sleek, modern, incredibly uncomfortable-looking sofa. "My key does not work, Greg," I said quietly, keeping my voice perfectly level. "And you changed the locks." Greg sighed, running a hand over his perfectly styled hair as if I were the one inconveniencing him. "Look, Dan, Sarah and I have been talking a lot while you were up in the woods. We made an executive decision. This house is just too big for you now. You are getting older. The maintenance, the stairs, the upkeep. It is all becoming too much of a liability." I stared at him. I was 68, but I still ran 3 miles a day and could frame a house faster than men half my age. "A liability," I repeated, tasting the bitter word in my mouth. "Exactly," Greg continued, emboldened by my calm demeanor. He stepped forward, crossing his arms over his chest. "So, we have decided to move in and take over the management of the property. We are going to modernize the place, bring it up to code, and take that burden off your shoulders. This is our house now, Dan. It really is for your own good. We cannot have you rattling around in this massive place all by yourself. It is not safe, and, quite frankly, it is selfish to hoard all this space when we are trying to build our future." I looked past him again, searching for my daughter's face. "Sarah," I called out softly. "Is this what you want? Are you throwing your own father out of the house he built for you?" Sarah flinched, but she did not step forward. She kept her eyes glued to the floorboards. "It is for the best, Dad," she mumbled, her voice barely a whisper. "Greg knows what he is doing. We will make sure you are taken care of." I turned my attention back to the porch. Sitting off to the side, half hidden behind a potted fern, were 2 suitcases. They were not my sturdy leather travel bags. They were cheap, thin nylon suitcases with crooked zippers. They had gone into my bedroom, sorted through my most intimate belongings, shoved them into discount luggage, and left them outside like garbage waiting for collection. A hot, violent spark of rage ignited in the center of my chest. I wanted to grab Greg by his expensive lapels and throw him off my porch. I wanted to demand the police be called. I wanted to rage against the profound, staggering disrespect of a boy who had never built a single thing in his life, stealing the castle of a man who had built hundreds. But then a colder, sharper instinct took over. If I fought them now, it would be a messy, emotional domestic dispute. Greg would claim I was becoming erratic or senile. He would use my anger to justify his actions to anyone who would listen. I needed to be smarter. I needed to let them dig their own graves. So I let the fire die in my eyes. I allowed my shoulders to slump forward. I let my jaw tremble just a fraction of an inch, perfectly mimicking the shock and devastation of a broken, exhausted old man. I dropped my fishing duffel onto the porch, letting it make a pathetic, heavy thud against the wood. "I do not understand," I said, letting my voice crack with manufactured fragility. "Where am I supposed to sleep tonight, Greg? I just drove 5 hours. I am so tired." Greg offered a tight, patronizing smile, clearly relieved that I was surrendering so easily. "Do not worry. Dan, I booked you a room at the Starlight Motel on the edge of town, just for a few nights until we figure out a permanent assisted living situation for you. I will even drive you there right now so you can rest." I nodded slowly, looking down at my worn-out work boots. "Okay," I whispered. "If you really think that is best..." Greg grabbed the 2 cheap suitcases, practically tossing them into the trunk of his brand-new leased luxury sedan. I climbed into the passenger seat, keeping my head bowed in defeat. As he started the engine and drove me away from my own property, he smirked at his reflection in the rearview mirror. He was completely unaware of the small, unmarked manila envelope sitting securely in the glove box of my old work truck still parked in the driveway, an envelope that contained a series of documents that would soon turn his arrogant smirk into ashes. We drove in silence toward the cheap, neon-lit motel. Sarah thought she was securing her financial future by locking her aging father out in the cold. But she had fundamentally misunderstood exactly who owned the ground she was so proudly standing on. Sitting on the edge of a sagging mattress in a room that smelled of stale smoke and cheap bleach, I realized the deepest betrayal was not losing my physical home, but knowing my own flesh and blood had spent years carefully plotting the theft. The neon sign from the Starlight Motel flickered a harsh red light through the thin, dusty curtains, casting long shadows across the stained carpet. My cheap nylon suitcases sat by the door, exactly where I had dropped them. I did not bother unpacking. There was no point. Instead, I sat in the dim light and let the weight of the past 15 years crash down on my shoulders, analyzing every mistake I had made that led me to this miserable, damp room. I am a man who spent his entire life building foundations. I spent 30 years pouring concrete, framing roofs in the blistering summer heat, and laying hardwood floors until my knees ached and my hands were permanently calloused. My late wife, Mary, and I built a successful contracting business from absolutely nothing. We skipped vacations, drove old trucks, and lived far below our means so we could build a life of genuine security. Our entire world revolved around providing a rock-solid foundation for our only child, Sarah. When Sarah wanted to attend an elite, out-of-state private university, I did not hesitate. I wrote the checks every single semester. Over $150,000, paid in cash over 4 years. I wore the same pair of steel-toed work boots until the soles literally split in half, so my daughter could walk across her graduation stage completely debt-free. I wanted her to start her adult life without the heavy chains of financial obligation. I thought I was buying her freedom. I now know I was only funding her sense of entitlement. Then she met Greg. Greg was a man composed entirely of hollow promises and leased luxury. He had soft hands, an expensive haircut, and a vocabulary full of corporate buzzwords that masked his profound incompetence. From the moment I shook his hand, I knew he was a liability. But Sarah loved him, or at least she loved the successful image he projected. So I held my tongue. I welcomed him into our family. I tried to teach him the value of hard work, but Greg viewed physical labor as something beneath him. He was always chasing the next big shortcut, the next brilliant startup idea that would make him a millionaire overnight. Over the last decade, I watched him fail spectacularly, time and time again. First, it was a high-tech app for dog walking that burned through $50,000 of angel investments. When the investors threatened legal action against Greg for mismanaging the funds, Sarah came to me in tears, terrified they would lose their rented condo. I quietly wrote a check to settle the dispute. 2 years later, it was a cryptocurrency consulting firm that collapsed almost instantly, leaving them buried under $80,000 in business loans that Greg had personally guaranteed. Again, I stepped in. I drained a significant portion of my liquid retirement savings to clear the ledgers and keep a roof over my daughter's head. His third disaster was a luxury watch importing business that turned out to be a massive scam, costing another $70,000 to untangle legally. In total, I bled over $200,000 to protect my daughter from her husband's arrogant stupidity. You might think a man whose father-in-law saved him from financial ruin 3 separate times would show a shred of gratitude. You would be wrong. Every time I bailed Greg out, his resentment toward me only grew. My hard-earned cash was a glaring, undeniable mirror reflecting his own failures. Because he could not match my success, he decided to belittle the way I achieved it. The disrespect started subtly. At family dinners, Greg would loudly boast about his networking events and digital assets, making snide, passive-aggressive comments about how traditional contracting was a dying, primitive industry. "Dan here works with his hands," Greg would say to his pretentious friends with a patronizing chuckle. "He does not quite grasp the mechanics of passive income or leveraging digital equity." I would sit at the end of my own custom-built dining table, gripping my fork, waiting for Sarah to defend me. She never did. She would simply sip her expensive wine and look down at her plate. Eventually, the invitations to dinner stopped altogether. They claimed I would not fit in with their new social circles, or that my stories about construction sites were too boring for their refined guests. I was slowly being erased from my own daughter's life, relegated to the role of a senile, embarrassing uncle rather than the patriarch who had financed their very existence. The most painful part was not Greg's arrogance. I expected that from him. The truly agonizing realization was watching Sarah transform into a woman I no longer recognized. The sweet, grateful girl I raised had been entirely consumed by her husband's insatiable greed. I knew exactly when the shift became permanent. It was 6 months ago. On the anniversary of Mary's death, I had invited them over for a quiet dinner. After we ate, I was in the kitchen washing dishes by hand, a habit I never broke. The kitchen window was open to the warm evening air. Greg and Sarah were sitting outside on the stone patio I had paved by hand, drinking the scotch I had purchased. They thought the water was running too loudly for me to hear them. They thought my silence at the dinner table meant I was growing deaf and oblivious in my old age. But my hearing is sharper than ever. "It is just sitting there. Sarah," I heard Greg say, his voice thick with frustration. "He is sitting on nearly $2 million in property equity and doing absolutely nothing with it. It is a massive waste of capital. We could be leveraging that." I stopped scrubbing the plate in my hands. I held my breath, waiting for my daughter to tell her husband to shut his mouth. I waited for her to remind him that this was her childhood home, her father's sanctuary, and that my finances were none of his business. Instead, I heard Sarah sigh. "I know. Greg, believe me, I know. We just have to be patient. He is getting older. He cannot live in this massive house forever. Eventually, we will have to step in and manage things for his own good." I stood frozen at the sink, the cold dishwater dripping from my hands. She did not defend me. She did not view my home as a place of love and memory. She agreed with him. She looked at the house I built for our family and saw nothing but an unliquidated asset. She looked at her grieving father and saw nothing but an obstacle standing between her and a payday. That patio conversation was the exact moment my heart finally broke, hardening into something cold and entirely practical. They thought my quiet demeanor that evening meant I was oblivious to their plotting. But that was the very moment I stopped being their financial safety net and started laying the foundation for a trap they would willingly, eagerly walk into. Now, sitting in the Starlight Motel, I allowed myself a cold, grim smile. Greg was so intensely focused on changing the physical locks on my front door this afternoon. He completely failed to realize I had already changed the invisible locks on my entire estate months ago. He thought he had outsmarted an old carpenter. He had no idea that a master builder never constructs a house without ensuring he has the only master key to the hidden doors. The hardest part of laying a perfect trap is forcing yourself to stand absolutely still while the wolves circle the bait, convinced they are the ones hunting you. I did not stay at the Starlight Motel for more than one night. As soon as the sun rose, painting the cracked asphalt of the parking lot in a dirty, pale light, I loaded my 2 cheap nylon suitcases into the back of my truck. I drove across town, away from the manicured suburbs, and deep into the industrial district. I pulled up to a faded brick building that bore my name on a weathered wooden sign, Dan's Custom Woodworking. This was the shop where I had built every cabinet, every door frame, and every piece of custom furniture that currently sat in the house Greg had just stolen from me. Above the massive ground-floor workspace was a small, 1-bedroom apartment. I used to sleep up there during the busy seasons, back when I was working 20-hour days to keep the business afloat and pay for Sarah's tuition. It smelled of old pine, tung oil, and decades of hard, honest labor. It was dusty and cramped, with a single window overlooking an alleyway. But it was mine. I carried my bags up the narrow wooden stairs, set them on the bare floorboards, and plugged in an old coffee maker. I was not a helpless victim cast out into the wilderness. I was a general retreating to a fortified bunker to orchestrate a war. I spent the morning cleaning the small apartment, wiping down the counters, and settling into the quiet isolation. I knew they would call. Guilt is a heavy burden for people who pretend to be righteous, and Sarah needed to convince herself that she was doing a noble thing. The phone rang exactly at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I stared at the glowing screen resting on the scratched laminate countertop. It was Sarah. I let it ring 4 times, letting her anxiety build, before I finally pressed the green button and held the phone to my ear. I did not speak first. "Dad?" Her voice floated through the speaker, thin and nervous. "Dad, are you there?" I cleared my throat, forcing a slight, wet wheeze into my breath. "I am here, Sarah," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I deliberately made my words slow and slightly slurred, like a man who had not slept and was buckling under the weight of profound confusion. "I know yesterday was hard," she began, her tone instantly adopting the patronizing, rehearsed cadence of a nurse speaking to a toddler. I could almost hear Greg coaching her in the background. But Greg and I talked about it all night. We want you to know this is not an eviction. This is a transition. We are transitioning you to a safer phase of life. You cannot manage that big house anymore. Dad, your memory is slipping, and we were terrified you might leave the stove on or fall down the stairs. My memory is sharper than a steel razor, and I could run up those stairs with a 60-pound bag of cement on my shoulder. But I swallowed my pride and leaned into the performance. "I just do not understand," I murmured, letting my voice crack with manufactured heartbreak. "My house, my things, You put my clothes in those cheap bags. Sarah, she sighed, a heavy, theatrical sound meant to convey her own suffering. It is for the best, Dad, and we are not abandoning you. We want to make sure you are totally taken care of while we handle the renovations and figure out your permanent assisted living situation. Greg set up an automatic bank transfer this morning. We are going to send you an allowance of $500 a month. That should cover your groceries and whatever incidentals you need at the motel. You never have to worry about money again. $500. I closed my eyes and leaned against the counter. I spent $150,000 in cash to ensure she graduated without a penny of debt. I drained $200,000 from my retirement accounts to save her husband from his own profound stupidity and keep them out of bankruptcy court. And now, sitting in the house I built, they were tossing me $500 a month like a bone to a starving stray dog, expecting me to wag my tail in gratitude. "Thank you, sweetheart," I whispered, injecting a pathetic, trembling gratitude into my words. "That is very generous of Greg. I feel so lost right now. I do not know what I am doing." "Just rest, Dad," Sarah said, sounding immensely relieved that I was rolling over so easily. The tension completely vanished from her voice, replaced by a sickening, self-righteous pride. "Stay at the motel. Watch some television. We will handle the heavy lifting from here." "I love you." "I love you too," I replied, the lie tasting like ash in my mouth. I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button to end the call. The silence in the dusty apartment was absolute. I did not cry. I did not throw my phone against the wall. I simply stood up straight, rolled my shoulders back until my spine popped, and let the frail, confused old man vanish entirely. My hands were perfectly steady. The trembling was gone. I walked over to the sturdy oak desk in the corner of the room. I unlocked the heavy bottom drawer and pulled out a thick, black, heavily encrypted laptop. It was not the cheap tablet Greg assumed I used to read the news. It was a high-end machine I bought specifically for managing my corporate assets. I booted it up, typed in a complex string of passwords, and opened my secure files. Then, I picked up my phone again and dialed a number I had memorized over 30 years ago. "Arthur," I said the moment the line connected. My voice was no longer shaking. It was solid, cold, and composed of pure granite. Arthur was my estate attorney, a sharp, ruthless man in his early 70s who possessed a brilliant legal mind and a deep, abiding hatred for arrogant fools. "Tell me the bait was taken, Dan," Arthur said, his raspy voice humming with anticipation. "Hook, line, and sinker," I replied, sitting down at the desk and opening a blank spreadsheet. "Greg changed the locks yesterday afternoon while I was on the road. They dumped my bags on the porch. Sarah just called me to offer a $500 monthly allowance. They think I am wandering around a cheap motel, completely destitute and losing my mind." Arthur let out a low, dry chuckle that sounded like sandpaper scraping across raw wood. $500? "The sheer audacity of that boy is almost impressive. I warned you he was greedy, Dan, but I honestly did not think he would be reckless enough to move this fast." "Does he have any idea what he just walked into?" "Not a clue in the world," I said, a grim smile finally touching the corners of my mouth. "He thinks he conquered the castle because he holds a new set of cheap nickel keys. He has no idea I wired the entire fortress with dynamite before I left." "Well, let him get comfortable," Arthur advised, the sound of keyboard clacking echoing through the phone line. "Let him start measuring the drapes and making plans." I checked the county clerk's digital filings this morning. Greg officially submitted the paperwork. He thinks he executed a masterstroke, but he just handed us the very rope we need to hang him. "Did he file the power of attorney?" I asked, looking at the blinking cursor on my screen. "He did," Arthur confirmed, his tone turning deadly serious. "Signed, notarized, and completely forged. He actually thought he could sign your name, claim you were medically incapacitated, and transfer the management of the estate to himself without anyone verifying the underlying deed." "Good," I said softly. Let him think he won. Let him start spending money he does not have. I want him to rip down the walls. I want him to sign his name to every single high-interest loan he can find to fund his little renovation project. We just need to monitor his progress, Arthur said. If we pull the rug out too early, he only faces a minor legal headache. We need him buried so deep in financial obligations that he can never climb his way out. I turned my gaze away from the laptop and looked out the dusty window, staring at the brick wall of the alleyway. Greg thought I was a dinosaur, a relic from a bygone era who did not understand technology or modern leverage. He thought I was blind to the world simply because I preferred to work with wood and steel. He did not know about the upgrades I made to the house 2 years ago, long before this betrayal began. Do not worry about monitoring him. Arthur, I said quietly, he thinks he locked me out, but I am going to watch every single mistake he makes, right from his own living room. A man who thinks he has successfully stolen a kingdom will always immediately sit on the throne and confess his sins to the empty room. 2 years ago, when Sarah first began heavily hinting that a man of my age should not live alone in such a large house, I decided to humor her fake concern. I hired a specialized private security firm to install a state-of-the-art smart home monitoring system. We did not just put a doorbell camera on the porch to see when the mail arrived. We hardwired tiny, high-definition lenses into the custom crown molding of the living room, disguised them within the smoke detectors in the hallways, and tucked them away in the dark upper corners of my built-in bookshelves. The entire setup cost me $18,000 in cash. Greg had been furiously offended when he found out about the expense, arrogantly lecturing me at the dinner table about wasting capital on complicated technology I was allegedly too old to understand. Because he believed his own lies about my intelligence, he never bothered to learn how the system actually functioned. He assumed it was just a local hard drive connected to a bulky monitor in my bedroom closet. He had no idea the entire network was cloud-based, heavily encrypted, and linked directly to the secure laptop now humming quietly on my dusty woodworking desk. He thought he had kicked me out of the theater, completely unaware I was now sitting comfortably in the director's booth with my finger on the recording button. I moved my mouse and clicked the icon to open the security dashboard. A grid of 6 high-resolution video feeds instantly illuminated the dim apartment. There was my kitchen. There was my hallway. And there, standing in the center of my living room, were the 2 thieves who had packed my clothes in cheap nylon bags. The audio feed kicked in a second later, the hidden microphones picking up the clink of glass with crystal clarity. Greg was standing by my antique mahogany bar cart, pouring himself a generous measure of my most expensive aged scotch. Sarah was pacing back and forth across the Persian rug I bought for her mother 20 years ago, nervously chewing on her thumbnail. "You need to relax, Sarah," Greg said, taking a slow sip of the amber liquid and sighing with intense satisfaction. "The hard part is completely over." The old man folded like a cheap lawn chair. "He is probably asleep in that disgusting motel right now, dreaming about his $500 allowance." He laughed, a cruel, sharp sound that echoed through the quiet room. Sarah stopped pacing and crossed her arms tightly over her chest. "I just feel sick about the way we did it. Greg, leaving his bags on the porch like that, what if he calls the police tomorrow? What if he hires a lawyer and tries to fight the power of attorney?" Greg waved his free hand dismissively, walking over to the fireplace and leaning against the heavy stone mantel I had laid by hand over a decade ago. "He is not going to fight anything. He does not have the energy. And more importantly, he does not have the legal standing. The paperwork I filed with the county clerk this morning is airtight." He set his glass down and pulled a folded document from his tailored jacket pocket, tapping it against his palm. "I paid a guy $3,000 in cash to perfectly replicate Dan's signature and provide a backdated notary stamp. The county clerk barely even glanced at it. As far as the state is concerned, your father is mentally unfit, and I am the sole legal manager of this entire estate." I leaned closer to the screen, my jaw setting into a tight, hard line. Greg's absolute confidence in that single fraudulent sheet of paper would soon become the very anchor dragging him to the bottom of the ocean. He was so incredibly proud of his own deception, completely blind to the fact that he had just confessed to a major felony. And he had done it all on high-definition video with crystal-clear audio. I pressed a combination of keys on my laptop, ensuring the recording software was capturing every single frame and routing the saved files directly to 3 separate, encrypted remote servers. "Okay," Sarah said, her voice shaking slightly as she walked over to the modern sofa and sat down. "So, we have the house. Now what? You promised me we would take our time with this. We can just live here, right? We can finally enjoy the space and stop paying rent on our condo." Greg's smug expression vanished instantly. His posture stiffened, and he took a sudden, nervous gulp of the scotch, finishing the glass in one swallow. He walked toward the front window, looking out at the darkened street before turning back to face his wife. "We cannot stay here. Sarah, we have to gut this place immediately. We need to rip out all this outdated dark wood, paint everything stark white, throw down some cheap luxury vinyl flooring, and get it listed on the open market within 30 days. Sarah stared at him, her eyes wide with genuine shock. 30 days? Gut the house? Greg, my dad spent years building those custom cabinets. You cannot just destroy his life's work and sell the house out from under us. Where are we supposed to go?" Greg slammed his empty glass down on the coffee table, the sudden, violent noise making Sarah physically flinch backward. The mask of the slick, successful entrepreneur completely slipped away, revealing the desperate, cornered rat trembling underneath. "We are selling it because we have absolutely no choice." "Sarah!" he shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "Do you think I wanted to move this fast? Do you think I wanted to forge a federal document today and risk going to prison?" He ran a trembling hand through his expensive haircut, his breathing suddenly shallow and uneven. "I am in trouble, Sarah. Deep, terrifying trouble. The kind of trouble your father cannot just write a polite check to fix this time." He paused, looking down at his expensive shoes, avoiding her gaze entirely. "I owe money. A lot of money." Sarah took a slow breath, her hands gripping the cushions of the sofa. "To who, Greg? To the bank? Another failed startup loan you did not tell me about?" Greg shook his head, a pathetic, fearful look crossing his face. "No, not a bank. I have been playing high-stakes online poker for the last 14 months. I thought I had a foolproof system. I thought I could build a massive nest egg for us without having to work a miserable corporate job. But I hit a bad streak. I got in too deep with a private syndicate operating out of the city. I owe them $250,000. Sarah, and they do not send polite collection letters in the mail. They gave me 60 days to clear the ledger entirely, or they are going to start making physical visits to our apartment to collect their pound of flesh." I watched my daughter collapse back against the sofa, her face entirely drained of color. She had betrayed her devoted father to secure what she thought was a comfortable financial future, only to discover she had tightly chained herself to a sinking ship currently engulfed in flames. Her horrifying realization of exactly who she had married was just beginning, but she was already in way too deep to back out now. $250,000? She whispered, the words barely making it out of her mouth as tears finally welled up in her eyes. "You gambled away $250,000 while I was sleeping in the next room?" "We can fix it," Greg pleaded, dropping to his knees in front of her and grabbing her hands. "This house is sitting on prime, highly sought-after real estate. If we do a cheap, flashy, cosmetic renovation, we can easily list it for $800,000. We pay off my gambling debt. We pay off the short-term renovation loans I am taking out tomorrow. And we still walk away with nearly $500,000 in pure profit. We can start over. Sarah, we can move away. Just you and me, but we have to move fast. I am bringing in an aggressive demolition crew on Thursday morning. We are tearing this place apart, starting with the kitchen." I sat back in my creaky wooden chair, the pale glow of the laptop screen illuminating my cold, impassive face in the dark apartment. The rot in my family went much deeper than simple arrogance or passive greed. It was pure, unadulterated, criminal desperation. Greg was preparing to physically destroy the manifestation of my life's work, simply to save his own kneecaps from a violent gambling syndicate. He was going to finance the destruction of my home with borrowed money, banking his entire physical safety on a fraudulent title transfer he thought made him a king. I closed the laptop monitor with a soft click, plunging the dusty woodworking apartment back into absolute darkness. The simmering anger I had felt yesterday on the front porch was completely gone, replaced entirely by the freezing, calculated precision of a master builder preparing to drop a massive iron wrecking ball on a house made of fragile glass. Sitting across from my attorney the next morning, I realized the most dangerous weapon my son-in-law possessed was not his staggering greed, but his absolute certainty that he was the smartest man in the room. He was about to learn a brutal lesson about arrogance, because a forged signature might steal an old man's personal checking account, but it cannot authorize the sale of a fortress that does not legally belong to him in the first place. Arthur's office smelled of old leather bindings, strong black coffee, and the quiet, expensive silence that only comes from decades of winning brutal legal battles. He sat behind a massive mahogany desk, sliding a thin manila folder across the polished wood toward me. Inside were crisp, color-copied pages of the documents Greg had filed with the county clerk 24 hours earlier. I picked up the heavy paper, studying the blue ink at the bottom of the page. It was a remarkably good forgery. The loops of my signature were perfectly replicated, capturing the slight slant I always used when signing off on building permits or massive lumber orders. If I did not know for an absolute fact that I was 300 miles away catching trout when this document was allegedly signed and notarized, I might have believed I wrote it myself. He paid a professional $3,000 for that forgery, I said, tossing the document back onto the desk with a heavy sigh. I heard him confess to it on the hidden cameras last night. He actually bragged about it to Sarah, right before he admitted he owes a violent illegal gambling ring $250,000. Arthur leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers together. He did not look shocked. After 40 years in estate law, he had seen every possible mutation of familial greed. $250,000, Arthur repeated, his raspy voice entirely devoid of sympathy. That explains the reckless speed. Desperation makes fools out of arrogant men. This power of attorney document gives him sweeping, absolute control over your personal finances. Dan, it gives him the legal authority to empty your bank accounts, liquidate your personal stock portfolios, and make medical decisions on your behalf. Arthur paused, a razor-sharp smile cutting across his weathered face. But there is one massive, glaring problem with Greg's brilliant master plan. A problem he would have discovered if he had bothered to spend $200 on a simple title search before committing a felony. I nodded, feeling a deep, quiet satisfaction settling in my chest. He thinks he stole my house, but I do not own that house? 7 years ago, shortly after my wife Mary lost her brief, brutal battle with cancer, my entire world shattered. The house we built together suddenly felt overwhelmingly large and hollow. During those dark months of grieving, I realized how fragile life truly was, and how quickly everything you work for can be ripped away by a sudden illness or a frivolous lawsuit from a disgruntled subcontractor. I wanted to ensure the physical legacy Mary and I built was wrapped in absolute, impenetrable legal armor. So, I walked into Arthur's office and completely restructured my entire estate. I did not just draft a new will. We formed an anonymous, private corporate entity called Ironclad Holdings Limited Liability Company. I took the deed to my custom-built brick home, along with the title to my woodworking shop and a few other commercial investments, and I legally transferred ownership of every single property entirely into the corporation. On paper, Dan, the retired contractor, does not own a single piece of real estate. I am merely the managing director of a corporate entity that owns the assets. This forged power of attorney, Arthur said, tapping his heavy gold pen against the fraudulent document, is made out in your personal name. It explicitly grants Greg control over assets owned by you as an individual. But the house is a corporate asset. This document is completely entirely worthless when it comes to the property deed. It gives him absolutely zero legal authority to list, renovate, or sell the house. In the eyes of the law, Greg is nothing more than an aggressive, uninvited squatter vandalizing a corporate-owned building. The sheer beauty of the trap was almost intoxicating. Greg thought he had bypassed me entirely, but he had merely picked the lock to an empty vault while the actual treasure was buried in a completely different country. And because I had sworn Arthur to absolute secrecy regarding the corporate restructuring years ago, neither Sarah nor her arrogant husband had the slightest clue they were standing on legal quicksand. "We need to strike right now, Dan," Arthur advised, leaning forward and resting his forearms on the desk. The predatory gleam in his eye was unmistakable. "I can have a judge invalidate this forged document by noon. I can call the local police precinct, hand them the video footage of his confession, and have Greg arrested for fraud, forgery, and trespassing before the sun goes down. He will be sitting in a concrete holding cell wearing an orange jumpsuit tonight, and Sarah will be begging you for bail money." It was a tempting image. The thought of seeing Greg in handcuffs, stripped of his expensive tailored suits and his insufferable superiority, sent a warm wave of vindication through my blood. But I shook my head, my face hardening into a mask of pure, cold stone. "No," I said quietly, the word dropping like an anvil between us. "If we call the police right now, the entire game ends prematurely. He gets arrested, he claims he was under severe duress from the gambling syndicate, and he cries to a sympathetic judge. He might serve a few months, or worse. Get off with strict probation and a fine. Sarah would likely empty whatever savings they have left to hire a sleazy defense attorney to keep him out of prison. That is not justice. Arthur, that is an inconvenience." Arthur raised an eyebrow, silently urging me to continue. "I want him ruined," I stated, my voice steady and completely devoid of mercy. "I want the kind of ruin that burns all the way down to the foundation and salts the earth so nothing can ever grow there again. Greg told Sarah he is bringing in an aggressive demolition crew tomorrow morning. He needs to rip out the dark wood and modernize the house so he can list it for $800,000. I stood up from the leather chair and walked over to the large window overlooking the bustling city streets below. To pay for a rapid, high-end renovation, he needs capital. And since his credit is likely garbage and he cannot legally borrow against a house he does not own, he is going to have to take out massive, high-interest personal loans, hard money lenders, the kind of loans that require personal guarantees and carry astronomical interest rates. Arthur slowly lowered his pen, the brilliant cruelty of my strategy dawning on him. "You want him to borrow the money?" "I want him to borrow every single penny he can get his hands on," I confirmed, turning back to face my attorney. "I want him to sign his personal name to nearly $100,000 in renovation debt. I want him to rip out my kitchen, tear down the walls, and hire the most expensive contractors in the city. I want him to believe his master plan is working perfectly. Because right now, there is a very specific clause hidden deep within the corporate bylaws I drafted, a legal trigger that Greg is going to pull without ever realizing his finger is on the weapon." Arthur let out a low, appreciative whistle, shaking his head in sheer disbelief. "You are letting him build his own gallows, and you are quietly handing him the nails." "Exactly," I said, walking back to the desk and picking up the forged document, folding it neatly, and slipping it into my jacket pocket. "We do not call the police. We do not block the contractors. We sit in the dark, we watch the hidden cameras, and we let my son-in-law dig a financial grave so deep that the sides collapse in on him. I just need you to handle one specific task for me. Arthur, I need you to find me an actor." The attorney leaned back, crossing his arms with a deeply intrigued expression. "An actor? What kind of actor?" "I need someone who can play the role of a very wealthy, highly motivated real estate investor," I replied, a grim smile finally breaking through my cold exterior. "Because once Greg destroys my house, he is going to be desperate for a buyer, and I intend to give him exactly what he wants, right up until the exact second I take everything away." Arthur chuckled, opening a thick leather-bound planner on his desk. "Consider it done, Dan. I know exactly the right man for the job." I left the law office and walked out into the crisp afternoon air. The trap was officially set. The legal parameters were locked into place, and the bait was dangling right in front of Greg's greedy, desperate face. All I had to do now was return to my dusty woodworking shop, turn on the hidden camera monitors, and watch the demolition of my own home begin. There is a distinct, agonizing sound that a solid custom-built oak cabinet makes when it is violently torn from a wall by a man who has never held a hammer in his life. I sat in the dark of my dusty woodworking shop, the blue light of the encrypted laptop illuminating my face, and listened through the hidden audio feeds as 30 years of my careful craftsmanship were splintered into firewood. Greg was swinging a rented sledgehammer with the frantic, uncoordinated energy of a truly desperate man, completely unaware that every single swing was legally binding him to a massive financial debt he could never possibly repay. Thursday morning arrived with a fleet of pristine, oversized pickup trucks parking aggressively on my manicured front lawn. Through the hidden camera tucked inside the living room smoke detector, I watched Greg welcome a crew of men wearing matching, spotless polo shirts bearing the logo of a high-end, overpriced boutique renovation firm. They were not real carpenters. They were the kind of flashy, fast-talking contractors who specialized in slapping cheap, trendy veneers over solid foundations and charging an absolute premium for the illusion of luxury. Greg stood in the center of the kitchen, pointing wildly at the heavy butcher block island I had clamped and glued by hand 2 decades ago. My wife, Mary, used to sit at that exact island every Sunday morning, drinking her coffee and reading the newspaper while I made pancakes for Sarah. Now, I was forced to watch a stranger in a clean polo shirt take a reciprocating saw to the thick wooden base, cutting right through the memories. I did not look away. I forced myself to stare at the screen, letting the anger crystallize into absolute, freezing focus. They ripped down the dark wood cabinets, tossing the heavy doors into a rented metal dumpster sitting in my driveway. They smashed the imported Spanish tile backsplash. They tore up the solid hardwood floors, exposing the bare subfloor underneath. Greg was directing the destruction with the arrogant swagger of a conquering general. But beneath the bravado, the hidden microphones picked up his heavy, irregular breathing and the frantic pace of his movements. He was terrified. The violent gambling syndicate had given him a strict deadline, and the ticking clock was echoing loudly in his ears. By early afternoon, the construction crew took a lunch break, leaving Greg alone in the ruins of my living room. I watched him pace back and forth over the exposed floorboards, holding his sleek smartphone to his ear. He had put the call on speakerphone, a habit born from his insufferable need to multitask, which allowed my hidden microphones to capture every single word of his impending doom. "Yes, I understand the terms," Greg said, his voice tight and breathless. $95,000, an unsecured personal bridge loan. I am fully aware of the 24% interest rate. I told you, I only need the capital for 30 days. I am flipping a prime piece of real estate, and the profit margins are going to be astronomical. A slick, indifferent voice crackled back through the speaker. The interest accrues daily, sir, and because this is an uncollateralized personal loan based entirely on your signature, you are personally guaranteeing the entire $95,000. If you default, we will immediately move to garnish your wages, seize your personal bank accounts, and place liens on any vehicles registered in your name. Do you consent to the electronic signature for the immediate transfer of funds?" "I consent," Greg practically shouted, wiping a layer of nervous sweat from his forehead. "Just wire the money." The contractors need their first 50% installment by the end of the day, or they walk off the job. I leaned back in my creaky wooden chair and let out a long, slow breath. $95,000 at 24% interest. It was a predatory, devastating financial trap, the kind of loan designed to bankrupt desperate people. And Greg had just signed his own personal name to the dotted line, using the funds to pay a boutique contracting firm to vandalize a house legally owned by a corporate entity he had absolutely no authority over. The forged power of attorney he filed earlier that week gave him control over my personal checking account, but it offered him zero protection against the massive personal debt he was currently accumulating. Sarah walked into the frame a moment later, carefully stepping over the scattered debris. She was holding a gleaming silver tablet, completely oblivious to the financial grenade her husband had just detonated. "Greg, I was looking at the staging furniture for the open house," Sarah said, her voice entirely devoid of the guilt she had pretended to feel just 2 days ago. Greed had officially washed away whatever remaining conscience my daughter possessed. "We cannot sell an empty house. I found a gorgeous minimalist collection. A white leather sectional, some glass coffee tables, and a huge modern dining set. It is totally perfect for the aesthetic." Greg rubbed his temples, his face pale beneath the layer of construction dust. "How much, Sarah?" "We are burning through cash right now." "It is only $14,000, she replied smoothly, tapping the screen of her tablet. "And I already put it on my premium rewards credit card. We will just pay the balance off completely the second the house sells. It is an investment. Greg, we have to spend money to make money." I watched my daughter smile, a cold, entitled expression that made her look like a complete stranger. She was financing luxury furniture on high-interest credit cards, banking her entire future on a fraudulent real estate transaction. They were building a massive, towering castle out of playing cards, completely unaware that I was standing right next to the table with a heavy industrial fan. A sudden thought struck me, a brilliant, technical detail born from 30 years of navigating the complex world of professional construction. I leaned closer to the monitor, closely examining the high-definition feed of the destroyed kitchen. The boutique contractors had exposed the intricate plumbing behind the walls to move the sink to a new kitchen island. They had also ripped out the drywall near the stove to run entirely new electrical wiring for a massive, commercial-grade oven. To run new plumbing lines and upgrade the electrical grid in this county, a contractor was legally required to submit detailed blueprints to the city planning office, pay a hefty filing fee, and wait up to 3 weeks for a certified inspector to approve the permits. There was absolutely no way Greg's high-end crew had pulled those permits. Greg was operating on a frantic 30-day timeline to pay off a violent criminal syndicate. He could not afford to wait 3 weeks for municipal paperwork. They were doing the heavy structural work illegally, fast and dirty, hoping to bury it behind fresh drywall before anyone noticed. I closed the encrypted laptop, grabbed my heavy canvas jacket, and walked out of the woodworking shop. I climbed into my old, reliable truck and drove straight toward the center of town. I parked in front of the imposing granite columns of the municipal building and walked through the heavy glass doors. The air inside smelled of floor wax and stale coffee, a scent I knew intimately from decades of pulling legitimate building permits. I took the elevator to the 3rd floor and walked into the Department of Building and Safety. I approached the long wooden counter, waiting patiently until a familiar face appeared from the back room. It was Marcus, a senior zoning clerk I had worked with for over 20 years. "Dan," Marcus said, his eyes widening in surprise as he adjusted his thick glasses. "I thought you retired. My friend, what brings you down to the bureaucratic dungeon?" "Finally building that cabin up by the lake?" I smiled warmly, resting my forearms on the counter. "Not quite yet. Marcus, I actually just came down to double-check some records on my primary residence. I hired a new management company to handle some minor cosmetic updates while I am transitioning into a smaller place, and I just want to ensure everything is above board. Could you look up my address and tell me if any active permits have been pulled in the last 48 hours? Marcus nodded, his fingers flying across his mechanical keyboard. He squinted at the glowing monitor for a few seconds before shaking his head. "Nothing. Dan, the last permit on this property was the one you pulled 2 years ago for the smart home electrical upgrades. The system shows absolutely zero new filings for plumbing, structural, or electrical work." "I see," I murmured, keeping my voice perfectly casual. "Well, that is certainly interesting. I suspect they might be getting a little ahead of themselves and knocking down some load-bearing walls without the proper city oversight." Marcus frowned, his bureaucratic instincts instantly kicking in. The city planning office did not take kindly to unpermitted gut renovations. "Do you want me to flag the property, Dan? I can send an inspector out there tomorrow morning to issue a formal stop work order. If they are messing with the main electrical lines without a permit, we will shut the entire site down and fine the contractor into oblivion." The offer was incredibly tempting. A stop work order would paralyze Greg's renovation immediately. But again, I needed to let the poison circulate deeply through his financial bloodstream before I administered the final, fatal blow. If the city shut him down today, he only lost a few days of labor. I needed him to spend every single penny of that $95,000 loan before the trap snapped shut. "Not just yet, Marcus," I said quietly, offering the clerk a knowing look. "Let them work through the weekend. Let them close up the walls and finish the rough in. But I would highly recommend you keep a city inspector on standby for next Thursday. I have a very strong feeling you are going to receive an anonymous tip about severe code violations. And when you do, I want your most aggressive inspector to hit that property like a hurricane." Marcus grinned, understanding perfectly that I was setting up a very deliberate ambush. "I will have Inspector Harris ready to roll. He hates unpermitted electrical work more than he hates traffic. Just give the word." "Dan." I thanked Marcus, turned away from the counter, and walked out of the municipal building. The sky was turning a bruised, dark purple as the sun began to set. Greg was currently standing in my kitchen, covered in dust, drowning in predatory debt, and entirely confident in his own brilliant victory. He was completely blind to the legal and financial hellfire I was methodically arranging around him. The city inspector was a rigid, unforgiving man, and I knew exactly the right moment to unleash him on my son-in-law. A man drowning in his own arrogance will always mistake a heavy iron anchor for a life preserver if you paint it the right shade of gold. When Greg pounded a private listing sign into my front lawn, he believed he was securing his salvation, completely unaware he was actually locking the door to his own financial prison. Watching the hidden cameras over the next 2 weeks was a masterclass in observing a train accelerate entirely off the rails in slow motion. The frantic, reckless pace of the illegal renovations had completely drained Greg's $95,000 high-interest personal loan. The boutique contractors he hired had slapped stark white paint over everything, laid down cheap luxury vinyl flooring directly over my solid subfloors, and installed the massive new commercial oven using the unpermitted, highly dangerous electrical wiring hidden behind the fresh drywall. The house now looked like a glossy, sterile magazine cover, entirely devoid of the soul or character Mary and I had spent decades building. To the untrained, desperate eye of a greedy buyer, it was a modern residential masterpiece. To a master carpenter like myself, sitting in the dusty dark of my woodworking shop, it was a superficial disaster waiting to catch fire or flood. With his borrowed capital completely exhausted and the violent gambling syndicate breathing heavily down his neck, Greg could not afford the time to list the house on the traditional open market. A traditional listing meant public scrutiny, prolonged municipal inspections, and the agonizingly slow bureaucracy of mortgage approvals. He needed cash, and he needed it instantly. So, he utilized a local real estate whisper network, listing the property off-market as an exclusive private sale. He set the asking price at $800,000, a ridiculous, inflated sum that practically screamed his intense desperation to the entire universe. He thought he was being incredibly stealthy by keeping the sale quiet. He did not realize my attorney, Arthur, practically owned the local real estate whisper network, and we had already hand-selected the specific predator who was going to answer Greg's desperate call. Arthur introduced me to a man named Sterling. Sterling was a retired corporate litigator who occasionally did highly specialized, completely legal favors for Arthur's firm. He possessed an intimidating aura of immense, untouchable wealth, wearing bespoke suits and carrying himself with the bored, dismissive energy of a billionaire who bought expensive properties the way other men bought cups of black coffee. Arthur and I briefed him meticulously on the exact psychology of our target. Sterling knew Greg was a terrified gambler masquerading as a slick, successful entrepreneur, And he knew precisely which emotional buttons to push to make Greg completely bypass whatever tiny fraction of common sense he still possessed. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon, Sterling arrived at my house for a private, exclusive viewing. I sat in my shop, sipping a cup of bitter coffee and watching the high-definition feed from the living room camera. Greg was sweating profusely in a tight suit, pacing near the front door. Sarah was anxiously arranging fresh flowers on the new kitchen island, trying desperately to look like a sophisticated, wealthy socialite. When Sterling finally walked through the door, he did not even bother to shake Greg's eagerly extended hand. He simply looked around the freshly painted room with a look of mild, practiced disgust. "It is entirely derivative," Sterling drawled, his voice carrying perfectly over the hidden microphones. "A classic flip, cheap materials masked by trendy lighting. But it is structurally sufficient for a short-term corporate rental portfolio I am building. I do not have the time or the patience for a drawn-out negotiation. Gregory, I am liquidating massive assets in another state and need to park cash immediately to avoid a severe capital gains tax penalty." Greg practically vibrated with excitement, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to maintain his professional facade. "Well, sir, we are looking for $800,000. As you can see, the renovations are completely top of the line and move-in ready." Sterling cut him off with a sharp, dismissive wave of his hand. "I do not care about your asking price, and I certainly do not care about your cheap vinyl floors. I care about speed and absolute compliance. I will offer you $960,000 in pure, unencumbered cash. That is 20% over your asking price, but I have two non-negotiable conditions." I watched Greg's jaw actually drop. He looked at Sarah, whose eyes were as wide as dinner plates. $960,000. It was enough money to pay off the violent gambling syndicate in full, clear his uncollateralized renovation loans, cover Sarah's ridiculous credit card debt for the staging furniture, and still leave them with a massive, life-changing pile of pure profit. Greg's blinding greed instantly short-circuited his brain. He did not question why a wealthy investor would overpay by that much. He only saw the massive dollar signs flashing in front of his eyes. "Name your conditions," Greg said, his voice breathless with pure adrenaline. "First, we close in exactly 30 days, Sterling commanded, pacing slowly across the living room. "Second, we waive all formal city inspections. I am paying entirely in cash, so there is no bank mandating an appraisal or a structural review. I take the property exactly as it is today, but the title must transfer flawlessly at the end of the month, or I walk away and keep my earnest money." Greg did not even hesitate. He did not consult a real estate attorney. He did not take a single day to review the paperwork. He just saw the golden life preserver and grabbed it with both of his greedy hands. "We have a deal," Greg said, practically shoving a blank preliminary contract across the new kitchen island. Greg thought he had just pulled off the greatest financial maneuver of his pathetic life, blissfully unaware that the waived inspection was the exact mechanism I needed to keep the city completely blind to the illegal electrical work until the perfect, catastrophic moment. The very second Sterling's luxury vehicle pulled out of the driveway, a massive, chaotic celebration erupted in my living room. Greg grabbed my daughter by the waist and spun her around, both of them laughing hysterically. They were rich. They had successfully defeated the system. They believed they had flawlessly stolen an old man's lifelong legacy and turned it into nearly $1 million in clean cash without a single consequence. I sat in the dark and watched my daughter laugh. The sweet, grateful girl I had raised was entirely gone, replaced by a stranger who felt absolutely no remorse for leaving her father to rot in a cheap motel. The euphoria of the fake sale completely erased the terrifying reality of their current financial situation. Greg no longer viewed himself as a man drowning in $250,000 of syndicate debt and nearly $100,000 of high-interest personal loans. He viewed himself as a millionaire waiting for a simple 30-day holding period to expire. And in Greg's shallow, image-obsessed mind, millionaires simply do not drive leased sedans. 3 days later, I watched a brand new, aggressively loud European sports car pull into my driveway. It was painted a blinding, metallic blue. Greg stepped out of the driver's seat wearing expensive new sunglasses and a heavy designer watch. He had gone to a predatory dealership and taken out yet another short-term, high-interest auto loan to secure the car, using the pending real estate contract as fraudulent proof of his impending massive windfall. He was spending the imaginary profits from a fake sale to buy luxury toys while standing proudly on the porch of a house he did not legally own. Sarah was no better. The hidden cameras caught her sitting on her new white leather sofa night after night, ordering thousands of dollars of designer clothing online and booking a luxury vacation to a tropical island, putting every single ridiculous charge on her increasingly strained premium credit cards. They were celebrating their absolute, undisputed victory, inflating a massive financial balloon with stolen air, completely ignorant of the fact that I was standing right behind them in the shadows, holding a very sharp needle and waiting for the closing date to arrive. There is a profound, suffocating silence that fills a room right before a carefully constructed lie is violently torn apart. Today was the day my son-in-law walked into that silence wearing a bespoke suit, completely unaware he was attending his own financial funeral. 30 days had passed since Greg signed the fraudulent real estate contract. 30 days of him driving a wildly expensive metallic blue sports car, drinking my aged scotch, and celebrating his absolute brilliance. The closing was scheduled for 1 o'clock in the afternoon at a high-end title company downtown. Through the hidden cameras, I had watched them get ready that morning. Sarah wore a brand new designer dress she had purchased on credit specifically for the occasion, and Greg spent 20 minutes styling his hair, practicing his most arrogant, victorious smile in the bathroom mirror. They thought they were minutes away from a $960,000 wire transfer. They had spent the entire morning signing preliminary escrow documents, never bothering to ask why the title company specifically requested a physical closing for a cash sale, or why the escrow officer seemed so incredibly tense when they arrived. I did not drive my old, battered work truck to the title company. I hired a private black car. I wore a sharp, custom-tailored charcoal suit I had not taken out of the garment bag since my wife's funeral. I stood up straight, my shoulders pulled back, letting the fabricated frailty of the last month completely evaporate into the crisp autumn air. I walked into the sleek, glass-paneled lobby of the title company, flanked by 2 men. On my right was Arthur, my ruthless estate attorney, carrying a thick leather briefcase. On my left was a broad-shouldered man with a closely shaved head and eyes like chipped ice. He was a licensed private investigator Arthur had retained for this exact moment. The receptionist pointed us toward the large executive conference room at the end of the hallway. Through the frosted glass wall, I could see Greg and Sarah sitting at the long mahogany table. Greg was checking his heavy designer watch, tapping his expensive leather shoes impatiently against the carpet. He was eager to collect his prize. Arthur reached out and pushed the heavy glass door open. Greg looked up, expecting to see Sterling, the wealthy corporate investor, walking in to finalize the paperwork. Instead, his eyes locked onto mine. The arrogant smile instantly froze on his face. He blinked rapidly, his brain completely failing to process the image of his frail, confused father-in-law standing in the doorway looking like a corporate executioner. Sarah gasped, dropping the silver pen she had been holding. It clattered loudly against the polished wood of the table. "Dan," Greg said, his voice instantly losing its slick confidence, replaced by a high, nervous pitch. He stood up, instinctively straightening his suit jacket. He tried to force a patronizing tone, falling back on the lie he had been living for a month. "What are you doing here? Who brought you from the motel?" "We are in the middle of a very important, confidential business meeting." I did not answer him. I walked slowly to the head of the mahogany table, pulled out the heavy leather executive chair, and sat down. I rested my forearms on the table, clasping my hands together. My hands were calloused and rough from 30 years of hard labor, but they were perfectly, entirely steady. Arthur took the seat to my right. placing his leather briefcase on the table with a dull, heavy thud. The private investigator remained standing by the closed door, crossing his arms over his chest, effectively blocking the only exit. "I am not at the motel, Greg," I said. My voice was no longer a weak, trembling whisper. It was a deep, resonant baritone, echoing off the glass walls of the conference room. "I have not been at the motel for 4 weeks, and you are not in a business meeting. You are sitting at the end of a very long, very dark road, and you have officially run out of pavement." Greg stared at me, his face suddenly draining of all color. He looked from me to Arthur, then to the imposing man guarding the door. The terrifying reality of the situation was beginning to seep through his arrogance, but he still desperately clung to his fraudulent paperwork. "I do not know what kind of game you are playing, old man," Greg stammered, his chest heaving as his heart rate skyrocketed. "But I have a legal power of attorney. I am the sole manager of your estate. I am selling the property today. The buyer is going to walk through that door any second, and you are going to leave before you ruin this deal." Arthur let out a dry, sandpaper chuckle that completely shattered the tension in the room. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a single, heavy document adorned with a raised gold notary seal. He slid it precisely across the polished mahogany until it stopped directly in front of Greg. "The buyer is not coming. Gregory," Arthur said, his voice dripping with absolute contempt. "Because the buyer does not exist. Sterling is a close, personal associate of mine. He was never going to purchase the house. He was simply acting as a mirror to reflect your own staggering, criminal greed right back into your face." Greg looked down at the document on the table. His hands were trembling so violently he could barely pick it up. Sarah leaned over his shoulder, her face a mask of pure horror. "Read the heading, Gregory," Arthur commanded. "Read it aloud." Greg swallowed hard, his throat clicking audibly in the quiet room. "Ironclad Holdings," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Limited liability company." "Exactly." Arthur smiled, leaning back in his chair. 7 years ago, Dan transferred the deed of the house, the land, and all associated properties into that corporate entity. Dan does not personally own the house. A corporation owns it. And Dan is the sole, exclusive managing director of that corporation. I watched the realization hit Greg like a physical blow to the stomach. He staggered backwards slightly, bumping into his chair. "The power of attorney you forged last month," I continued, keeping my eyes locked onto his terrified face, "was made out in my personal name. It gave you illegal control over my personal checking account, but it gave you absolutely zero legal authority over a corporate asset. You forged a key to the wrong house. Greg." "No," Greg breathed, shaking his head frantically. "No. The county clerk accepted the filing. The title company approved the escrow. This is impossible. The title company works for me," Arthur interrupted smoothly. "They were fully aware of the corporate structure. They simply allowed you to sit in this room today to ensure we had your physical presence when the trap completely closed." I leaned forward, dropping the final, crushing weight onto his shoulders. "You do not own the house, Greg. You never did. You have been illegally squatting in a corporate building. You have absolutely no legal right to sell it. The contract with Sterling is completely void. There is no $960,000 wire transfer coming to save you." Sarah let out a choked, devastated sob, covering her mouth with both hands. She looked at her husband, the man she had betrayed her own father for, and finally saw him for the pathetic, ruined fraud he truly was. "You owe a violent gambling syndicate $250,000, I said, my voice cold and entirely devoid of mercy. Greg flinched violently at the mention of the syndicate, his eyes widening in pure terror. He realized I knew everything. "You owe a predatory lender $95,000 for an uncollateralized personal renovation loan. You owe a dealership for that ridiculous blue sports car parked outside. And Sarah owes tens of thousands of dollars on high-interest credit cards for staging furniture. You have over $400,000 in immediate crushing debt. I paused, letting the silence hang in the air for a long, agonizing moment. And you have absolutely zero assets to pay for any of it. Greg fell backward into his chair, his expensive suit suddenly looking 3 sizes too big for his deflating, terrified body. He put his head in his hands, pulling at his carefully styled hair. He was completely, utterly ruined. But the forged deed and the canceled sale were only the beginning of the avalanche. I had prepared a much heavier rock to drop directly on his chest. There is a distinct difference between losing a game and realizing you never even understood the rules you were playing by. Greg sat at the mahogany conference table, his breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps as the devastating reality of his massive, unpayable debt finally crushed the air out of his lungs. He was drowning in a turbulent sea of his own making, but I was not quite finished pouring the water. I nodded to the broad-shouldered private investigator standing guard by the frosted glass door. He stepped forward, his heavy boots silent on the expensive carpet, and dropped a thick, overstuffed manila folder directly onto the table in front of my son-in-law. The heavy slap of the paper echoed in the quiet executive room like a rifle shot. "Open it, Gregory," Arthur commanded, his raspy voice cold and undeniably sharp. Greg reached out with violently trembling hands and flipped the heavy cardstock cover open. The very first thing he saw was a glossy, high-definition photograph printed in perfect color. It was an image of Greg himself, standing in my living room, holding a crystal glass of my aged scotch, laughing as he bragged to Sarah about paying $3,000 to a professional criminal for a perfectly forged signature and a backdated notary stamp. Greg choked, physically recoiling from the table and dropping the photograph as if the paper had burned his fingers. "You recorded us," he whispered, his eyes wide with a profound, sickening terror. "You spied on us inside the house. You have been watching us the entire time." "It is a corporate property, Greg," I reminded him, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any warmth. "And I am the managing director. I have every legal right to monitor the interior of my own commercial investments, especially when uninvited guests are inside the premises. Turn to the next page." Greg blindly fumbled with a thick stack of papers. The next dozen pages were a meticulously documented timeline of his absolute financial destruction. There were time-stamped photographs of the boutique contractors ripping my custom oak cabinets from the walls with iron crowbars. There were detailed transcripts of his frantic speakerphone conversations with the predatory hard money lenders, explicitly agreeing to the $95,000 uncollateralized loan at a staggering 24% interest rate. There were even copies of Sarah's premium credit card statements, highlighting the $14,000 she had eagerly spent on modern staging furniture for a house she did not own, followed by the receipts for the luxury island vacation she booked using imaginary profits. "You see, Greg," I said, leaning back in the heavy leather executive chair, "when you took out that high-interest renovation loan, you signed a personal guarantee. You used your own name, your own social security number, and your own fabricated financial history. You did not borrow money against the house because you could not legally use the corporate property as collateral. You borrowed unsecured cash, and you handed every single penny of it to a crew of overpriced vandals." Arthur tapped the mahogany table with his heavy gold pen, drawing Greg's terrified attention back to the attorney. "Which brings us to the final document at the very bottom of that folder. Gregory, as the legal representative for Ironclad Holdings Limited Liability Company, I am officially serving you with a massive civil lawsuit for the malicious destruction of corporate property. You authorized the demolition of custom woodwork, imported Spanish tile, and solid hardwood subfloors. We have formally appraised the total damages at $150,000. And since you are not a licensed contractor and you possessed absolutely no legal authority to alter the structure, your personal financial liability is absolute." "I do not have that kind of money," Greg sobbed, tears of pure panic finally spilling down his pale cheeks. He looked like a terrified, cornered child. "I do not have anything. The syndicate gave me 60 days. They are going to kill me. Dan, if I do not pay them $250,000. They are going to find me and they are going to break my legs. Or worse. You have to stop this. You cannot just leave me to die. I did not force you to sit at an illegal poker table, I replied coldly, feeling absolutely zero sympathy for the pathetic creature crying in front of me. I did not force you to forge my signature on a federal document. I did not force you to buy a ridiculously expensive blue sports car you cannot afford. And I certainly did not force you to swing a sledgehammer into the kitchen island I built with my own 2 hands. You dug this grave with incredible enthusiasm. Greg, I am simply refusing to throw you a ladder now that you have finally hit rock bottom. Sarah suddenly pushed her chair back, the harsh scraping sound cutting through Greg's pathetic sobbing. She stumbled around the edge of the mahogany table and physically dropped to her knees right next to my chair. She grabbed the sleeve of my custom-tailored charcoal suit, tears streaming down her carefully made-up face, completely ruining her expensive designer aesthetic. "Dad, please," Sarah begged, her voice high and desperate. "You cannot do this to us. We will lose everything. They will take his car. They will garnish my wages. We will be forced into bankruptcy. He could go to federal prison for the forgery. Please, Dad, I am your only daughter. You have millions of dollars in equity. You can pay off the syndicate. You can clear the loans. Just help us this one last time, and I swear we will never ask you for another penny. I love you, Dad. Please." I looked down at the woman kneeling on the carpet. For 30 years, her tears had been my absolute weakness. Whenever she cried, I moved mountains to fix her problems. I worked double shifts in the blistering heat. I drained my retirement accounts. I compromised my own security just to ensure she never had to face a single hardship. But as I looked at her now, all I felt was a freezing, impenetrable calm. I did not see my sweet little girl anymore. I saw a greedy, entitled stranger who had enthusiastically plotted to steal my home and lock me out in the cold. I gently but firmly pulled my arm away from her frantic grasp. "You did not love me when you left my clothes in 2 cheap nylon suitcases on the front concrete porch," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the heavy weight of absolute finality. "You did not love me when you called me at the dusty woodworking shop and offered me a pathetic $500 monthly allowance from my own stolen assets. You did not love me when you sat on your new white leather sofa and laughed with your husband about gutting the house your mother and I built for you." Sarah recoiled as if I had struck her across the face. She stayed on her knees, covering her face with her trembling hands, sobbing uncontrollably into the carpet. "You made your choice." "Sarah," I continued, staring straight ahead at the frosted glass wall, refusing to look down at her again. "You chose the slick promises of a greedy fraud over the silent devotion of the man who gave you everything. I am not your father anymore. I am simply the managing director of the corporation you attempted to defraud." Arthur stood up, snapping his heavy leather briefcase shut. The sharp click echoed with brutal finality across the large room. "You have exactly 24 hours to remove your personal belongings from the property," Arthur stated smoothly, looking down at Greg's broken form. "This is not a standard residential eviction, Gregory. This is a commercial trespassing violation coupled with extensive, documented felony fraud. If you are not completely off the premises by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, I will hand the unedited video footage of your forged confession directly to the district attorney, and you will be arrested in your driveway before lunch." I stood up, adjusting my jacket and smoothing the lapels. I did not spare a single parting glance for my ruined son-in-law or the daughters sobbing on the floor. I walked toward the heavy glass door, the private investigator stepping respectfully aside to let me pass. They thought the financial devastation in this conference room was the absolute worst thing that could possibly happen to them. They were entirely unaware of the aggressive municipal trap I had scheduled to arrive at the house the very next morning to ensure they left my property with absolutely nothing but the clothes on their backs. There is a distinct, crisp quality to the morning air when the heavy rot of betrayal is finally dragged out of your home and discarded on the front lawn. I arrived at my property exactly 10 minutes before 9 o'clock, parking my reliable old work truck at the end of the long driveway. I sat in the cab, the engine ticking quietly as it cooled, and waited for the final curtain to fall on my son-in-law's pathetic, fraudulent play. The manicured suburban street was perfectly quiet, bathed in the pale golden light of the early autumn sun, standing in stark contrast to the absolute financial devastation about to erupt on my front porch. Precisely at 9 o'clock, a white municipal sports utility vehicle pulled up to the curb, closely followed by 2 local police cruisers with their light bars entirely dark. Arthur, my brilliant estate attorney, had requested a civil standby to ensure the eviction proceeded without any desperate violence from a man cornered by a criminal syndicate. I stepped out of my truck and walked slowly up the stone pathway just as the heavy front door swung open. Greg was dragging 2 massive, heavy suitcases across the threshold. His face was entirely devoid of the smug, arrogant sneer he had worn like a mask for the last 30 days. He looked exhausted, physically shattered by the crushing weight of the $400,000 in debt he now carried squarely on his own back. His expensive tailored suit was wrinkled, and his hands trembled violently as he gripped the plastic handles of his luggage. Sarah walked out closely behind him, carrying a single leather overnight bag. Her eyes were puffy, red, and swollen from a long, sleepless night of weeping. She kept her gaze fixed firmly on the concrete porch, absolutely refusing to look in my direction. Inspector Harris from the city planning office did not offer a polite morning greeting. He was a rigid, unforgiving bureaucrat who despised illegal construction more than anything else on earth. He marched straight past Greg, flashing his metal city badge, and stepped directly into the stark white foyer of the house. He only needed 60 seconds to spot the glaring, highly dangerous electrical work hastily shoved behind the massive new commercial oven. Harris walked back out onto the porch, his face set into a mask of pure, absolute fury. He pulled a bright red, heavily laminated stop work order from his clipboard and slapped it directly onto the glass panel of my custom front door. He loudly informed Greg that the property was officially condemned for human habitation until a licensed, permitted commercial contractor completely gutted the hazardous wiring and restored the structural integrity of the load-bearing walls. He then handed Greg a thick yellow citation containing $12,000 in immediate municipal fines for unpermitted structural demolition, adding another heavy, suffocating rock to the massive pile of unpayable debt crushing my son-in-law. The 2 police officers stepped forward, placing their hands resting casually on their duty belts, and instructed Greg and Sarah to vacate the premises immediately. There was no argument. There was no dramatic screaming or pleading. They were entirely broken, their spirits completely crushed by the flawless execution of my corporate trap. Greg dragged his heavy suitcases toward the driveway, aiming for his aggressively loud, metallic blue sports car. But as he reached for the driver's side door handle, the screech of heavy air brakes shattered the quiet morning. A massive flatbed tow truck turned the corner, its amber lights flashing brightly, and aggressively blocked the end of the driveway. The predatory dealership had not received the massive, imaginary wire transfer Greg had promised them yesterday afternoon, and they had instantly triggered the Global Positioning System repossession clause buried deep within his high-interest auto loan. Greg dropped his bags onto the manicured green lawn. He stood perfectly still, his shoulders slumped in utter defeat, and watched in absolute, helpless silence as the burly tow operator hooked thick steel chains to the front axle of his leased luxury toy and dragged it brutally onto the flatbed. Several neighbors had stepped out onto their porches, holding their morning coffee mugs, openly watching the humiliating spectacle unfold. With no house, no car, and absolutely zero cash, Greg and Sarah were forced to call a cheap, discount rideshare service to carry them away from the estate they had so enthusiastically tried to steal. They stood on the curb for 20 agonizing minutes, surrounded by their luggage, refusing to speak to each other. When a battered, rusted sedan finally arrived, they climbed into the back seat without a single backward glance. I watched the car drive away, carrying them off to face the violent gambling syndicate and the ruthless hard money lenders entirely on their own. As the vehicle disappeared around the corner, a profound, overwhelming sense of absolute peace washed over my entire body. I walked up the stone pathway, peeled the bright red municipal sticker off my front door, and used my heavy brass master key to unlock the deadbolt. I stepped into the kitchen, the morning light streaming through the large windows. The boutique contractors had completely destroyed my custom oak cabinets and ripped up the beautiful hardwood floors, leaving a sterile, poorly constructed mess of cheap vinyl and stark white paint in their wake. A lesser man might have wept at the sight of his ruined life's work. He might have looked at the empty spaces and felt nothing but the agonizing sting of betrayal. But I am a master builder. I did not see destruction when I looked around my kitchen. I saw a perfectly clear canvas. I walked over to the exposed section of the wall, reaching out to run my calloused hand over the rough timber framing I had placed there 30 years ago. I smiled. The bones of the house were still perfectly strong. The foundation had not shifted a single inch. I had millions of dollars in corporate equity. I had all the time in the world, and I possessed the exact skills required to rebuild this entire house, piece by piece, exactly the way I wanted it. Society often tells us that blood is thicker than water, and that we must unconditionally forgive our family members simply because we share the same genetic code. We are conditioned to endure endless disrespect, financial drain, and emotional manipulation, all in the name of keeping the family together. But a toxic foundation will eventually collapse the entire house, regardless of who poured the concrete. Cutting my daughter and her arrogant, fraudulent husband out of my life was the most painful, agonizing amputation I have ever endured. Yet, as I stood in the quiet ruins of my kitchen, I knew it was the only possible way to save the rest of the body from their infectious, terminal greed. I am 68 years old, but as I walked out to my truck, grabbed a heavy iron crowbar from the toolbox, and prepared to tear down the cheap, sterile renovations Greg had illegally installed, I felt younger and stronger than I had in a decade. I was no longer a financial safety net for ungrateful children. I was no longer an old man relegated to the corner of the room. I was finally, truly home. And I was exactly the only master of my own castle. Thank you all so much for listening to my story. If this journey resonated with you, or if you have ever had to make the difficult choice to cut toxic people out of your own life, please take a brief moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with anyone who might need a reminder that true strength comes from setting absolutely unbreakable boundaries. I would love to hear your thoughts on how everything unfolded, so please drop a comment below with the word justice to let me know you made it to the very end of the video. And do not forget to hit that hype button so this story can reach more viewers who appreciate a satisfying tale about standing up to greedy relatives and taking back what is rightfully yours.